Before we get started too much, I want to take a real quick poll. How many of you guys are using a print management solution like PaperCut, Pharos, ePrint, something like that? Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of experience with many of those, but one of them I do. How many of you are just using a plain old Windows print server? How many no print server at all? All right, that's more than I expected. We'll get into that. So a little bit about me real quick. I work for a large higher education institution. It's similar to Penn State, where we have facilities all over the state. We have multiple IT units all working in their own little units. And I work in the central IT, where I help support those other units where they need it. And I'm the primary point of contact for anything that's Apple related. But not only am I the Mac guy, I also maintain a large share of the network printing on campus. You can find me at mscottblake on Slack, Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub, pretty much anything you can think of. I'm all about sharing knowledge. I do it day to day. I share concepts, processes with my coworkers, with other IT units. I'm hoping to do the same thing with you guys today. You can take notes if you want. Don't, it doesn't matter to me. I've got all of these slides. I've got some of the scripts I'm going to show you on my GitHub repo here. I'm going to leave this here for a bit, make sure people can get some pictures, but if you don't get it in time, I'll have this at the end. All right. So my main goal here is to show every one of you something that's tangible, no matter how big or small your shop is. So something that you can take home with you and hopefully make your lives better. If you're currently installing printers manually, I want to fix that. I want you to leave here confident in automating something. If you're already battle hardened, my hope is that you can find something in here that'll make it easier for you to scale. We're going to take a look at some of the most important commands and some of the options that are frequently used with them. I'll walk through a script that can be used for multiple printers, and we'll talk about scaling up from there. Again, my hope is that no matter your skill level, something will help. All right, so let's start this off with a simple question. I get asked this question all the time, and I mean, it is the built-in method. But the answer is usually no, so let me explain why. The driver must be installed prior to the printer, or else it will be created with a generic driver, and that's usually no fun. It's okay for some, but as an example, I have 40 different drivers that I push, and ensuring that the specific driver for that specific printer is installed already is nearly impossible for me. You can deploy a printer with a config profile, but you can't remove it in this way. When the config profile is removed, the printer stays on the machine. So we aren't really managing the printers as much as we are pushing them using a config profile. And when created with config profiles, printers are known to the system as MCX something. Users will see the name that you give it, but you can't target scripts based on that name. You have to target based on the MCX name. And those are created based on the order that they're installed. So that can be inconsistent even in a lab where everything gets the same printers. It just depends on the order. So using that as an example, say you deployed 2 printers yesterday to a group of machines, and APNS seemingly installs them in a random order. But you need to modify one because you messed something up. It becomes more difficult because you have to figure out which one's which first in whatever script you use that you're going to make the modification in. And then to make matters worse, you can't just remove it and reinstall it because, like I said, it doesn't remove the actual printer. So you have to try and figure that out and modify or doing that. So for me, this is the big thing. You can't easily set up the printer options with a profile. So most people end up scripting that anyway. So for example, if you're already writing a script to disable the printer sharing, why not just add the printer in the same script? And lastly, creating and maintaining individual config profiles can be a real pain when we start talking hundreds of printers. To recap though, I do think that deploying printers via config profile is viable in certain situations, like say a lab or someplace where you have control over the hardware. and you're sure that you're never going to make a modification to it. So real quick, how many people are actually using config profiles? That's more than I thought. There's basically nobody. So since Apple's built-in method doesn't work real well, we need to work around it. So a lot of the examples I'm going to go through involve some scripting. If you're just getting started, don't feel ashamed if you find yourself swearing at the screen all day. We all do it. But that said, I truly believe that learning to write your own scripts is a worthy endeavor. There's great power in the command line, and if you're not utilizing it, you're really limiting yourself. Now, I don't see Greg in here. If he's in the overflow room, I love this quote. He made it like 5 years ago. Luckily, I have a cheat sheet here to help you write some good code. Well, maybe not good code. So let's get into it. So, Swift was developed by Apple, so maybe it can help. I just learned about this yesterday. I did some digging in their documentation, and I was able to find some print-related objects. But unfortunately, they can only get printer objects. You can't really set information. So you can't create a new printer. You can't modify existing printers this way. You can really only interact with existing objects, and you can send stuff to the printer. You can create print jobs with Swift. You can't create printers themselves. So that doesn't really help a whole lot. And it looks like Objective-C is the same way. So we're really going to end up depending on the shell binaries. And for the sake of those of you who are not fluent with the command line, I'm going to take a dive into some of the basic commands just to make sure everybody's on the same playing field here. So this is the generic print driver. I know it's impossible to read because I couldn't read it while I was creating slides. It's obnoxiously long. I wanted to show it all together at some point, just to give you guys an example that when they show it on slides or whatever, you may end up looking something like this. That's all one string. So if the printer you're installing doesn't have a Mac driver, you can use this to get the basic functionality. It can also work if your users don't really need to do anything special. If you're just printing and nothing else, say it's a really old printer and there's no Mac driver, this is okay. But in my opinion, it's better to use the correct driver whenever it's possible. So if there was one that is available, I'd recommend using it. So when it comes to printers, LPAdmin is a MacAdmin's best friend. This is the binary that does all of the heavy lifting. It's used to add, configure, remove printers, as well as setting the default, and it can do a whole lot more than that. The P option designates which printer we want to use. In the example of the config profiles, this is what the MCX0 name would be. If it doesn't already exist, this command will create it. If it does exist, it'll modify it. This can't use spaces, it can't use tabs, some special characters. So if you need that, you end up using the D command. And this is where you use a user-friendly name. And if you pass this to that command, your users will see this. The P printer name without the space, the users will never see that unless this is omitted. I lost myself here. Now, I probably should have come up with a better naming scheme because trying to describe which one's which is hard, I just found. My apologies. So adding the L option allows you to specify the location. This is also user-facing. I tend to use the building name and room number in my locations, but really anything descriptive can go in this field. And the V option is used to specify where to send the print jobs. So in this case, it's an IP printer, and it's just going to 10.10.10.10. Most common protocols are HTTP, IPP, LPD, and SMB. You don't really have to know those. They're in the manual. I'll show you how to get there in a minute. The P option tells you where the driver file is. And this is where you want to go for, and I tend to just scan this directory looking for the printer I'm looking for and get that specific path, because it's almost everything is in library printers, PPDs, contents, resources. Almost every print driver outside of the generic. And the O option will configure the printer options. So this may be handy if you need to enable duplex. If it's just an optional parameter for this printer, you'd set the duplexing in here. You can add an optional tray. You can lock it to grayscale instead of color, that type of thing. Multiple options can be set in the same command. I do see a lot of tutorials and a lot of sample scripts that have a different LPAdmin for every single option, and that's just not necessary. Just put them in one command. And then the E option enables a printer, and it tells it to accept print jobs. Also, a lot of samples will have, there's another command called cups enable or something like that. This just does that for you. All right, so the D sets it as the default. You'll notice that we're using printer name without the spaces again. So this is the system's identifier for the printer that we're using. And then the X option will delete it. All pending print jobs are deleted and aborted as part of this command, so you don't have to do any of that overhead. And as with most commands, you can use the manual tool to view the full list of options. This is just scratching the surface of LPAdmin, but as a MacAdmin, these are the tools that I use. These are the commands, the parameters. If you were in Adam's class session right before this in this room, it kind of goes into this a little bit. Now the LP options command allows you to get or set printer options and defaults. Options are set per user unless you run it as root. At that point, it's set for all users. But given its name, you'd think that this would be the best way to configure settings. Unfortunately, options set via LP options don't appear in the GUI. So if you enable the extra tray for this printer, your users aren't going to see that. They're not. It's available, but it's just weird. You can do that with LPAdmin, and they do show in the GUI in that way. Since we can set options in multiple places, I want to kind of go through how they're set, how they're retrieved. So the machine will first look at the user level LP options. If they exist there, they'll use that. If they don't, it'll look in the root level LP options. And again, if they're not there, then it'll look in LPAdmin. So if you're setting something in LP options, it's going to take precedent, and it's not going to be visible to the users. So I recommend shying away from doing this and just setting them in LPAdmin. This, however, is what LP options is mostly used for. This command will list the available driver options and their current values. The problem, though, is that this is a wall of text. And looking at this, it's pretty hard to figure out what you actually want to do. If you want to change something like color printing, you have to just kind of scan through and find what you're looking for. So let's work through that process and see if we can make it better. So first, we're going to take that wall of text and we're going to redirect it to a file. In this case, I'm naming it before.txt. You'll see why in a minute. Then we need to actually make the change. And the easiest place to do that is through the cups GUI. Now, cups is Mac OS's printer interface. So you'll first have to enable the web interface because it's off by default. And then you'll have to hit this in a browser. Clicking on it as a link doesn't work for some reason, even in Safari. It's really weird. But if you type that in and hit enter, it'll work. Once you're in there, you just need to click on the printer that you want to change. You'll click on that administration drop-down. And then you'll select default options. I know that's not the best, most highlighted thing, but that's what I ended up with. So then you'll scroll through. All those same options are listed in this web page. They're using a user-friendly name and some actual options for what you can set. You just want to find the ones that you're looking for, change them, and then you'll scroll to the bottom and you'll hit submit. Now, I changed these two. In this example, I'm setting this to a black and white printer, a grayscale printer. I had to set a third option, but I will get to that here in a minute. Now that that change has been made, we can get a list of the options again, and we'll redirect that to a new file. In this case, again, after text. So we have a before and we have an after. They're essentially snapshots. And to easily see what was specifically changed, we just run the diff command. I recommend making only one change at a time. This is kind of troubleshooting 101, but a lot of people don't think it through when they're doing it because they've got deadlines and they just want to set all their settings and figure out what changed. By doing it one at a time, you can programmatically compare the files and document the changes. So if I know that I need to set this printer from color to black and white, I know I only need these settings. And you don't have to sift through it every single time. It does make the whole thing easier in the long run. So here's some sample of the output from that diff command. In this section, this is where I changed those two drop-downs. Now, I have no idea why this model has two options for the same thing, by the way. It drove me nuts. Oops. Sorry. Now, the star on these is next to the color and CMYK in the first part. And those are from the before text. And then the bottom half shows that the star next to the grayscale and gray, those are the rules from the first part. You can kind of see that with the angle brackets. It's kind of obscure, but that's a before and after change. Now, I chose this example specifically because it actually bit me a couple years ago. It bit me hard. I manually scanned that list of options. I didn't even put it in a text editor to get color coding because I'm an idiot. I walked through that wall of text line by line, looking for the settings I was looking for. I found two that worked. I couldn't figure out why there were two, but whatever. So I changed to both. To my surprise, it didn't work. While troubleshooting that, though, I found the web interface. I set the same thing, but I couldn't get the page to submit. It said there was a conflict with select color being grayscale and simulation profile being auto. I had no idea what simulation profile was at the time. I still really don't. But it suggested setting that from auto to none, and I did, and it worked. Again, I still have no idea why it is a conflict, but I never would have found it without that web interface. And that's an example of how the GUI can help you find that extra setting that you need to make this change that just for some reason should work. Of course, this is how I felt after I figured it all out. Has anyone got to live out this fantasy? Yeah. Yes? Who wants to be that guy? Because I do. So anyway, the end result looks something like this. I'm setting the three options I need to be set, and I'm specifying the specific printer to modify. Like I said, since this one already existed, I'm not adding it, I'm just creating it, or modifying it. This can be deployed to production to make changes to an existing printer, or the options just can be added to a new installation script, or both, depending on what you need to do. It's the same syntax for adding as it is for modifying. Now, finally, don't forget to disable cups when you're done, or your security team will come after you. Even though it is only open to localhost, I prefer to do it. Another useful command is the LPStat. This is used to display the information on printers. They're already installed. When you're using LPStat, if you add a printer name to the end, most of the options will present information about that single printer. If you leave it off, they tend to be for everything. This one will tell you whether the printer's paused or if it's enabled. Again, omitting the name will just list it for everything. And likewise, it will list all of the printers and it'll tell whether they're all paused or enabled individually. This one will get the default printer. This one will show the status information of all the printers. There's lots of different information. T is kind of the catch-all. And again, adding the printer name to that will just list that one. It'll be everything that it knows about that one printer. But there's other options that are useful. LPStat's pretty powerful. And just like LPAdmin, you can check the manual for more details. So let's put these tools to work. This next example is for those of you who are manually installing, really. Remember, a good MacAdmin is a lazy MacAdmin. The lazier you are, the more you're going to script, the easier you're going to be long run. I actually have this printed and hanging in my office to remind me, and I refer to it all the time. So not every script needs to be super robust, especially if you're just starting out. Sometimes having everything hard-coded is exactly what you need. If you only have a couple printers, this is perfectly viable for you. In the end, this script will ensure that the sales printer, that's what the P is, it's configured consistently on all the devices, and it gives you something to audit and test with each new release of the operating system. I do want to dive into the weeds of this for a quick minute, though. The shortened path you see here for the generic print driver is really just for these slides. In the scripts, it's not like this. If I had the full script in there, you couldn't read anything else. So I just shortened it up. I did this across the board in later examples too. Just keep in mind that when you see that the ellipses at the end, that's just a continuation of that god-awful path. So these slashes at the end indicate that a command continues on that next line. So this is good for taking a single command that is just as long as that generic driver path, and you can put it on one screen and you can see all the options nice and easy. Again, for slides, it's fantastic. The rest is pretty straightforward, though. We're giving it a name and a location, we're setting the URL, and we're setting some options. And then at the end, we're just enabling the printer. Now, one of the IT units that I help support, it's on a regional campus. They've got 9 Macs in a lab. They've got 3 staff Macs. They've got 12 total on their entire campus. They're a bunch of Windows admins. And no one really knows how to support Mac OS well. So I do a fair amount of support with them. So despite what I just said, these IT admins would look at that and would tell me it's just easier to install it manually. And if I'm being honest, they're probably right. By the time they go and they find their notes, they open terminal, they browse to the path to the script, and then they run it, it probably is going to be faster. Does it sound familiar to anyone else? Anyone else supporting staff that are like that? Yeah, that's what I figure. So what if you could run that same script just by double-clicking it? Think that'd help those people? This looks a little funny, I know. It's the same script, though, but it's wrapped in a little bit of AppleScript. You don't have to do that, really. I did this so that it would prompt for admin credentials so that it would install it for all users on a machine, just to kind of show that it's possible. If you run LPAdmin as a user, it installs the printer for just that user. If you install it with root, it installs for everybody. So the first thing we note is that it is bash. It's inside of AppleScript. So some of the slashes are a little different. Some of the quotes are a little bit different. That's just because it's wrapped up and you have to escape some things. There's lots and lots of tutorials out there on the internet on how to do this and read it, so I'm not going to give too detailed in it. Just know that it's possible. So the script gets copied into the script editor, and it's just saved as an application. So I created a little demo for you to show that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open System Preferences and then Printers to see that nothing's installed already. And we're going to open Script Editor, and we're going to paste in that script that was just on that side. Next, we're going to save it, selecting Application as a file format. And we can name it whatever we want. In this case, I just use Sales Printer. And then now we just need to test it. So let's double click on the file that we just created. We're going to type in the admin password because the Apple script in there. And there it is. So this will benefit some, even the smallest of offices, such as that regional campus I was telling you about. Drop this application onto a USB stick, double click it, and go. For users of text that aren't familiar with Mac OS, you really can't beat double click. Doing this, again, you're using a hard-coded script, you're plugging that into Apple script. It's not the most maintainable, but sometimes that's okay. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this next example. It's a lot like the first one. The idea with this is that you don't have to create a separate script for each individual printer. You can put them all in a single script when it makes sense. For example, if you have a small shop where everyone gets these three for simplicity, no need to make a different thing for every, depending on the user. If it's not a burden for your users to see 3 printers instead of 1, it's not worth your effort to make it so that they only see the 1. You just run it multiple times. Now, more often, you'll run into a situation where everyone in sales gets 2 printers. Everyone in marketing gets a different 4 printers, something like that. Or everyone in building A gets all of the printers in building A. Depending on your scale, you can have different groups that all have the same group of printers. And this is a good example of something like that. Just like the previous example, you can make each copy into an application for easier deployment. Now, this seems like a good place to make a disclaimer. So, like I said, this code's on GitHub. I'm posting it here. You guys can review it. You can ask questions. Just please don't copy and paste code from the internet if you don't understand it. That's the key part of that phrase. You have to understand it. If you don't, that is truly the path to the dark side. Now, this goes for my stuff too. If you don't understand it, please ask me. That's why I put my handle out there. I'm happy to help. I say that because this third example is much more robust. It's written with a print server in mind, but it really doesn't have to be. A couple little changes here and there, and you can send it to an IP print or a print management solution, which is what most of you guys are doing. As long as you have a web path that you can send it to, the script will work for it. So let's take another real quick poll before I get into this. This is a little long. How many of you guys have more than 50 printers? That's more than I thought. How about 100? How about 500? You guys are starting to feel my pain. I have 615 last time I counted. I have 4 different print servers. Funny thing is that's not my entire campus. It's just some. This script generally works for all of that. I've got a couple different copies of it in my Jamf Pro instance, mainly because of Jamf's limitations. Otherwise, this script works for everything. I even have a copy for IP printing that just took a couple little things. Like I said, it is pretty robust. It takes parameters for most of the common options, but that means it's just for a single printer. So you push this script, it will install 1 printer. First thing though, you gotta set up a couple quick variables. Like I said, this is really for a print server, but we can modify it. Like for instance, Ferris, you can set the protocol to pop up and it works. You set the print server name to whatever you want it to be visible to the user, and then the path to it. It utilizes all of Jamf's available parameters. You could probably modify this to accept all of the options in one to make it a little better, but I haven't had the need for that yet. Now note that because, like I said, this is going into Jamf, the parameters start at 4. If you're not using that, rewrite this and start it at 1, you get some more, things like that. So in this section, it really deals with some string manipulation. This is where I'm setting the user-friendly name, and this is setting it to be the same as Windows does. So it's printer name on print server, just to be consistent in my shop. If you don't care about that, change it. This is a little special. This is Jamf specific. It's doing a little bit of black magic in the background. For those of you familiar with Monkey, the first step is similar to setting the driver package to requires, so that it ensures the driver is installed first. That's really what this is doing. In this script specifically though, one of the input parameters is a policy trigger name. If that gets passed in, that's for the driver. So it'll call that driver. Now, I have that policy set to only run if you need the driver. So we can call the policy all we want, and if you don't need the driver, it doesn't actually run it. In my environment though, we have our driver package is available to all of our users' computers, but only if they don't have it installed, like I said. Now after the policy call, it checks to make sure that the driver exists on the system, and if it still doesn't exist at that point, then it fails. Now, here's a good example of that LPStat command being used to determine whether it's installed. If it is, it calls LPAdmin and deletes it first. This way I know that if this script is run, we're getting a new printer installation, no options pre-exist from the one before, we have a clean slate. Then here's the core of that script. We've seen it before. We're running LPAdmin. This is what does the actual installation. You can see all of the configurable options. These are the things that we passed in through those parameters. And then these are options that I want to be set on every printer across the board. By coding them into the script, I don't have to specify them on each individual printer. It saves me a little bit of headache. The default error policy will pause the entire printer if it hits an error. So instead, I set it to abort the job instead of pausing the printer. There's a lot of use cases where the users just can't fix that. And pausing the printer entirely creates an outage, and that's unacceptable in some situations. So in this case, I just want to abort the job. Setting the auth to negotiate will enable curb rows for this printer. But it'll still fall back to username and password if curb rows doesn't exist. So all we're really doing is adding functionality. And then lastly, I think it's pretty obvious why I don't want the printer to be shared. If I have 600 printers and they're all shared, that's a problem. Now down at the bottom of the script, this is a little bit much, but this is what kicks it all off. It calls the main function, which then calls the others. It seems a lot like overkill, but what I found is that the more you can compartmentalize your code, the more reusable it becomes. Using a main function like this, it can help with debugging, especially if you have a big error handler on your script. I don't have one in this, so it is a little overkill, but for this, it's all right. So does it scale? Quite simply, no, it doesn't. Like I said, you need a different deployment for each printer. If you have 50 printers, that's okay. But as you get bigger, that can be a huge burden. In my case, that's potentially 615 Jamf Pro policies, one for each individual printer that calls this script. In actuality, it's about 400, but I've already seen performance degradation. That's why I don't have every one of them in there just as a blanket statement. So, previous examples were all in Bash and AppleScript. I think Bash is great for starters. Especially for this, since you really have to do it for the LPAdmin command. There's basically no other way to do it in a scripting language. But it does have limitations. So next example is in Python, but I'm not going to walk through it. So a little over a year ago, a project popped up on GitHub that I was instantly drawn to. This was created by Matthew Warren. You may know him as Haircut. Thank him for me. This tool requires a fair amount of work up front, though. The end result is you have a single script that can install all of the printers in your organization. It was designed for Jamf Pro, but I do think that it can be used in Monkey or something else. In Monkey, I think you just set this as an on-demand install, and it should work. Unfortunately, I don't have any experience with Monkey, so I'm just basing that on what I've read. I'd imagine this work with other management tools, anything that can run scripts. You probably have to do a little bit of tweaking, but I think that's manageable. So the only requirement is that Code Dialog must be available to install by some means. So then you just modify the configuration options, and you'll essentially create a flat database of the printer queues, and you put that in a CSV form. So that project uses a JSON file to configure. It's essentially its language pack. You have a couple options, but most of these things are, how do you want this displayed to your users? So if you have a specific name for your help desk or some unit that you want them to call for help, this is where you'd put that in. Now, this is where most of that implementation work will be spent. You'll essentially create a big CSV file with all of the different fields that you need into it. The good news is that the same information you're probably already using, you may not have it in one place, but this will help with that in the long run. The cool thing is that you can add a new field into this file, and it'll be added to that printer metadata. It can then be used to limit available printers, and I'll show you how that works a little bit. And once you have your config file and your CSV ready, you just use this command and put it all together. So what this really does is it takes the configuration options and the CSV, it turns the CSV into a JSON, essentially. It takes all the config options and actually injects them into various parts of the script. It will make a big file. In my case, that's about 8,000 lines of code. All of the printers are embedded into it, though, so I don't need to go and I don't have to make sure it has an internet connection or anything like that to go and pull the list of printers it should be able to get. It embeds all that stuff in there. So the config JSON, it had a field in there to designate the output directory, so that's where this puts it. So you go there and you'll find a new printer installer file, printerinstaller.py file. At this point, you can add that file to your management tool of choice and you're good to go. But if you want to test it first, nudge, nudge, here's the format for that. Since this was built with Jamf Pro in mind, the first 3 parameters are reserved. The only one that we really care about is the third one, and that's the username. The first 2, you can just put junk into them. I used 1 and 2 respectively just to show that a little easier and take up less room. All right, so after that, you specify the default location. If you enter a value here, it doesn't display the picker that you saw in that GIF earlier. It just installs that printer. And then the filter field and value. The filter field looks for the header of the CSV file. So you'd give it location or display name, something like that. Then the filter value performs a search on that. This will run a script without any options. It'll show all available printers in one big list. This will not display the available printers. Instead, it will just automatically install that printer. This could be useful if you need to get a large group of people to install the same printer, a lab or a conference or something like that. because sometimes it's just easier to make a separate deployment. So what I would think is that you have one that just lists everything, and then you can make copies of that for individual printers as needed. So this will only list the available printers that have waterfront in the location. Doing this would require a deployment for each building, which is better than each printer, I guess. But at some point, scale might dictate that, or something along those lines at least. You could also limit the list by the URI field, and then only show printers from a specific print driver. You can have a different deployment for each print server or something like that. Depending on what data you've added into your CSV file, though, you can filter on any of those fields. So for example, you could add a field that contains the printer type, which be like laser, inkjet, plotter, or something along those lines, maybe by brand. And then you can just create a deployment that only shows Konica and Minolta, only shows Canon, something along those lines. Again, if your list starts getting ridiculously long, maybe you think of ways to break it up a little bit, because managing 10 is a whole lot better than managing 100. So the script as it is can only do offline static filtering like that, though. There is no way to limit it per printer and to do that on the fly, at least until now. So in my shop, because we have so many, we use Active Directory to decide who has access to the printers. If you're granted access to printer A, you're added to an AD security group for printer A. So therefore, I needed a way to limit that list to only privileged printers, and to do that on a per user basis rather than upfront. So I forked Haircut's repository and I modified it a little bit. Now my fork has some new JSON configuration options, and it was modified to accept what's called an AD filter group in the printer definition. I did talk to Haircut about this, and we're still trying to figure out whether this is going to get rolled up into his repository or not. I think we still have a little bit of work to do. So if you go to this and it's not there, that's why. We've rolled it up. Now, if that happens, I'll try and make a link or something that redirects it back there. These are those new JSON options. They're all, for the most part, relating to AD. The name format with the printer group is really just so that the LDAP search lookup goes quicker. If you're limiting it by something, it is phenomenally faster. And then you're just really giving it the path to where you can find AD. Space is a little limited on the screen here, so I left some of the info out on this slide. The only difference between the CSV and Haircut's file is the addition of the AD printer group, or AD filter group that's on the end there. If that field is left blank, like printer 2 is, it's assumed that everyone should see it. So it's essentially the same as Haircut's file. If there is a value and that user is not a member of that group, and it does check recursively, the user will not see that option in their dropdown. So for instance, if I am a member of only printer 1, I would see printer 1 and 2 when I run it. Now, AD groups can be one-to-many. So if you're a member of the Woodburn Hall group, you'll see both printer 3 and 4 in addition to 2 here. So this method can kind of allow us to more easily limit available printers to groups if we needed to, without creating multiple deployments like I was mentioning a minute ago. All of that same static filtering does still work though with this. The difference is that available list of printers is shrunk. It's dynamically filtered as well as the static. So this is the final product in my environment. This is my live screenshot. Like I said, I have 615 printers, but only 4 are showing because of the AD group filtering. I consider that a great success, that users are not searching and scrolling and accidentally clicking off the list and having to do it again, as users do. If they don't have access to it, it's not even an option. Now, I am trying to keep this management tool agnostic. I know there's a bit of a Jamf lean to it. While I don't have any experience in Monkey, I still wanted to talk briefly about this tool. It was written by Nick McSpadden. Among other options, you can feed this script a CSV file. It takes a lot of that same information as the other one. And it'll spit out package info files, which is what Monkey takes, and it's in the no package style. So it's pretty clear to me that the biggest pain points relate to not being able to query for the printers, to be able to get the list. That upfront work is really unavoidable at the moment in Mac world. So we need to create homegrown scripts to interface with our existing tools and CSV files to perform bulk operations, things like that. Really, there has to be a better way to do this than what we're doing as a community today. I'm kind of hoping that this can kind of spur that along a little bit. I would like to see some more projects that are tool agnostic, similar to maybe AutoPackage, that the entire community can rally around, because frankly, printers aren't going to go away anytime soon. If anything, new technologies will only increase demands. Unfortunately, I don't foresee printers getting any better either. Nor do I see driver installers getting any better. I know that feeling. All I do know is that it's going to be an uphill battle for most of us. So the more that we can work together, the more we can accomplish. And with that, I intentionally left this a little bit short so that we could have some time for some Q&A. As promised, though, I did have the link to the presentation at the end, so I'll leave this up while we do questions.
You mentioned that it's Jamf specific. Back in the beginning with the code, with the functions that, it has like the numbers instead of the reserve numbers.
Uh-huh.
If we're not a Jamf user, do we just comment out that function, or does it automatically ignore that function?
So if you take the script that I posted there without changing it at all, it's still going to take the 4th, 5th, 6th parameters. You can throw junk into 1, 2, and 3, like I was showing with the printer installer Python file. I just threw junk into 1 and 2 because it didn't matter. You can do the same, or you can modify the script to start at 1. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Either way works. Over here.
With the, when you have that CSV file, say you go in and you have to make a change to a printer, how does that handle with, if the printer's already been installed, with that sort of version change?
It doesn't.
It doesn't?
You make the change in the CSV, you run the generator again, it spits it all back into one script. Now you'll re-upload the script in place, but it does not change anything that's already been deployed.
It won't reevaluate, okay.
No. That's kind of a Mac OS problem, more than anything.
Just one thing we find sometimes useful in our own printer deployments. I've sort of done it like a scripted reset of the Mac printing system.
Mm-hmm.
So if you need to clear the slate and reinstall printers, that's one way to do it.
Yeah. I wish I'd have thought about putting that in these slides, because that's a really good solution, to be able to just wipe it out and start over, and instead of modifying. And I really expect more questions than this.
On the variables for when deploying multiple printers, you have print server protocol, SMB. For a print server, do you know what the typical default print server protocol is between SMB, IPT, or LPD?
If you're sending just to a specific printer?
Mm-hmm. A print server, like an ID print server.
Print server, if you're using Windows, it's usually SMB.
Okay.
Sorry. LPD used to be the standard. It's been deprecated in Windows 2016, Server 2016, so most nowadays are using SMB. Different tools may have their own. Like I was saying, Pharos, I know, uses pop-up to interact with its pop-up client that they have on the machine. I'd say those are the two. You might also see HTTP or HTTPS. It just depends on what your print server is sharing. You know, it'll have a path to it. You just have to make sure that it lines up with that.
Have you ever had to work with Canon printers where different departments have different department IDs that they have to enter?
I do,
And
unfortunately.
Do you know a good way to automate that?
No.
Okay.
The problem with that, at least with account track codes, which I'm assuming that's the lingo for one manufacturer at least, the code itself is considered a password,
Yeah.
and so there's no way to pre-populate that without going into the user's profile preferences for that printer in specific, and any change that they make gets it overrides that and all that stuff. So no, I haven't found any way to automate that.
Yeah, because we've had that problem consistently, and there's a couple of solutions, but none of them seem to be really great, and they're
Oh, yeah.
all very hackish. So
Yeah,
figured I'd ask.
it's a big pain point for me as well.
You talked about going in and enabling the cup server to do that. And I agree with the outputting and diffing and stuff like that, because that's I normally install the printer. Most of the options I found common across, we're generally an HP shop unless someone goes and buys their own crap. The going through the GUI a lot of times will give you a lot of the settings without having to go into cups, and it will reflect those changes when you run LP options. And I find a lot of times those non-defaults are normally near the beginning of the file, but there's some accounting, like Xerox has accounting stuff in there. But have you found a difference between going into the cups interface to make those changes rather than going through the GUI? Is it just what's exposed?
I prefer to use the cups interface because I know that those values that are listed there are the exact same values that LPAdmin's using.
Yeah.
They're utilizing the same stuff. Some manufacturers, I don't trust the manufacturer to make sure that those values are the same and that they're not doing some translation behind the scenes. So I prefer cups, but really, whatever works. If you're getting the same values, I wouldn't change it.
Yeah. And a lot of times I find if you install the printer locally, directly to the printer, if you're not going through a print server, certain manufacturers, some of those defaults will come through that negotiation. And then there's some weird ones like maybe memory size or, again, specific to maybe more to HP or Xerox, that you have to go to the printer's web interface and find that stuff, and they tend to hide that very well a lot of times.
Yes, they do.
And then you were talking about I know in LPD you said it was deprecated. I know you can enable the service to run, so a Mac can print to a Windows server. I know you do that in a couple situations with print servers, but
it still works in Server 2016, but Microsoft's trying to get people to stop using it, so I'm trying not to.
SMB. I think you have to have some. I think I've had issues with Kerberos with the authentication where it's not picking up. So, and again, that's between old print servers and new print servers. So.
Mm-hmm.
When they were detecting the AD users and what printer access, I'm assuming it's the application. Do they need to have admin rights to run that application?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
The problem, so launching the printer installer itself, no. It'll launch in a user session. Actually running the installer, they'll have to have the LPAdmin rights to do it. You'll have it's a Mac Mac group to do so, but it should work. Again, running it as user tends to put it only in that user session though. No one else?
So I really like the where you're using the AD filter groups. If you if that machine can't reach AD at the time, how does it filter? Is it just going on the
It
one?
doesn't.
So it's
Um,
just doing that non-dynamic filtering.
I actually meant to say that in there. So thank you. I limit that to only on-prem. If you're not on campus, that installer is not an option for you.
Gotcha.
It doesn't show up because you can't reach AD. And
probably
that right
printer-
there is kind of the problem with why it has not already been rolled up into Haircut's build. Because there needs to be a little bit of refactoring in the code so that it will fall back and just ignore that field if it doesn't exist,
Okay.
or something like that. I'm not entirely, we're not entirely sure how we want to handle that yet, you know. I told him I wanted to present on it, and so I went ahead and left it forked at the moment. I went down the rabbit hole of trying to create a Kerberos ticket if it didn't exist, and I was getting all kinds of timeouts and errors, and I said, you know what? If it doesn't exist, just fail. So if it can't reach AD, it doesn't work.
You just put the little message in your self-service that says,
I-
hey, run this
I-
only on campus, or run this only while you're connected to the local network, and
I think that's
they can be a user.
Yeah, I think that's the
Okay.
error, the added error message is, hey, I can't talk to that.
Okay. So then your help desk says connect to VPN or plug
Right.
in something.
All right. Well, if there is nobody else, I would appreciate it. It's my first time presenting here. If you guys take the time to hit that feedback link and let me know how I did. It's also on the schedule site. If not,
Can you switch back to
this?
No, the previous one.
And the same link's down there at the bottom.
Oh, the presentation.
Hmm? Why is that not there? What are you looking for?
The barcode?
That. Sorry. Again, this takes you to that GitHub repo. It's got these slides. It also has some of the scripts I showed. And the slides will also be on Penn State's site. So thanks for letting me get up here.